Next in your unit, we have Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. And it's quite interesting because we explore both the Gothic and the Romantic together. So this story has characteristics of Romanticism as well as that of Gothic. It also carries those characteristics a step further with an emphasis on narrative perspective, character development and description, exploring ideas relevant to human nature and representative of social issues, and a leitmotif, a leading motive of dead walls. So you'll find this piece both dark but also quite compelling, I think. The story explores the frontier aspect in the sense that freedom is analogous to freedom of human behavior and will versus the more literal interpretation. This freedom, however, is not without cost to the individual and society. We'll talk about human nature and social issues. Growth of industrialization is also represented in the story, with a particular emphasis on the consequence of industrialization on the individual and society. So what does industrialization mean to man? What does it mean to us as a whole? But what does it mean to an individual person? The setting in Melville's piece is a small windowless space, and it's created by the expansion of society and industrialization. So this has an insular effect on Bartleby. It represents his separation from society. So what industrialization has actually done is it's taken man outside of nature and put him in a box. And that's really important to understand when reading this piece. Using rooms to suggest states of mind. This is a very Gothic characteristic that we see Poe do as well in our next unit. It's also apparent in this concept that Bartleby chooses not to participate in society. He has shut himself out, both literally and figuratively. The narrator also feels the effects of industrialization. He has difficulty hiring reliable, skilled employees. The sinister, grotesque, or claustrophobic atmosphere is a characteristic of the Gothic. It's also a characteristic of Romantic subject matter. Bartleby seeks the claustrophobic, whereas the narrator seeks to understand it and escape from him. The claustrophobic atmosphere represents the constraints of society, the constraints of industrialization of the world as it is. Escapism is also a readily made connection in the preceding. The emphasis of the story is on human nature, particularly on understanding why people don't act as one expects them to. The narrator seeks to understand Bartleby, which causes him to question his own behavior. Bartleby simply acts as he wants to, but of course, it is more complex than that. Allegorically, Bartleby represents all that is wrong with society encroaching on human nature and exerting his individual human nature, i.e. his unwilling to partake in society. It has negative effects, which in this case is death. You can logically conclude that conforming to society, as seen in the narrator, and not conforming, as seen as Bartleby, has consequences. The plot is somewhat improbable in the sense that virtually no one would stand for Bartleby's behavior, which is an unlikely characterization. However, the story is more than just a superficial rendering of one man's behavior. As I pointed out, the romantic attitudes take a slight different tact in the story as well. Obviously, the events of the story ask the reader to use their imagination and suspend disbelief, but the emphasis on human nature is so strong that readers should be able to imagine the possibility of the events instead of the improbability. So we should be able to imagine someone being as stubborn and as non-compliant as Bartleby. And you probably have encountered someone not as extreme as Bartleby, but someone who has been pretty stubborn. The narrator's responses to Bartleby are emotional, but he attempts to reason the advent of those emotions, and the lack of Bartleby's emotions. Other characteristics of the Gothic prevalent in the story include the description of the landscape of outside versus inside, challenges readers to define rationality, and supernatural versus metaphysical otherness. The small, cramped interior spaces contrast with the relief the narrator feels when he leaves his office. Outside is the only escape he has since Bartleby won't leave. Bartleby's behavior asks the reader to question what is rational behavior. As for the supernatural and metaphysical otherness, I'm going to perhaps stretch your perceptions. Although Bartleby is real, he can be seen as a metaphor for the narrator's other, in a similar vein to William Wilson. Bartleby does what the narrator wishes to do. The narrator himself feels hemmed in and weighted down by his responsibility as a businessman and as a member of society. He is intrigued by Bartleby because Bartleby successfully does what he wishes, escape. He realizes, however, that escape is not without cost. The narrative perspective, of course, is entirely that of the narrator. The reader is privy only to observations filtered through him. His superfluous, extravagant language and musings on his status and life establishes his view of himself and others. He uses words such as execrable, obstreperousness, pernicious, and paroxysms to imply he is above the others, which serves to separate him as a character. Again, think of his otherness as a narrator. However, some of the word use is indicative of the period. On the surface, it appears the story is about Bartleby, but it is a journey of self-discovery for the narrator as well. So remember we said in the romantic lecture that the narrator may not always be trustworthy. So this is, again, an example of just his perspective. It doesn't mean that his perspective is reality. The character description is developed through the narrator and dialogue, but consider that the dialogue is told only from the narrator's perspective. There is no real action other than Bartleby preferring not to. It is the narrative perspective that develops the story and the character. The description of the characters is designed to set up contrast and show human nature and vices. Each of them have their own. His descriptions label the characters. Turkey is a drunk, Nipper is a borrower, Gingernut is 12, simply immature. Bartleby doesn't play well with others, and the narrator attempts to be manipulative in the process is himself manipulated. So again, this is from the narrator's perspective. So something to think about. People don't understand those who are different if they cannot define others and their motivations. It is human nature to categorize others to make sense of the world. So if we can't understand you or you understand your motivations, then we see you as the other. Another thing to consider or concept to consider when you're reading this piece is rational thought versus irrational thought. The narrator rationalizes not only his behavior, but expends significant effort trying to rationalize Bartleby's completely irrational behavior. The question of what rationality and irrationality are arises. What is really rational? Is it rational to rationalize the irrational? Doesn't make a lot of sense. This shows that one cannot cut themselves off from society without repercussions. So we can't just go into nature. We can't just accept that romantic ideal and just completely get rid of science and industrialization. To persist in doing so destroys the individual. This signifies the theme of human isolation. We are a part of a larger entity, and yet we are isolated in individualism that our society is based upon. And this is a real conflict that we face even today as Americans. But certainly at this period, America is unique. It's this unusual identity in and of itself. And we are struggling with dealing with um, uh, our individuality in the sense of the big picture in the world that we have to work within and trade with and live with in order to grow as a country. So, two men, one has no communication with himself, and the other has no communication with the world. Ultimate difficulty humans have in connecting with one another. We do have challenges. That's one of the hardest things that we do as people, but also something that intrinsically as humans we want to do. Bartleby's life and death show a dehumanizing impact of American capitalism and materialism. It turns individuals into submissive wage slaves or destroys them by indifference and misunderstanding. So in other words, this is also a commentary on what industrialization does to human beings or has done. A leitmotif is a dominant or recurring theme in a novel that serves as an allegory. An allegory is the representation of abstract ideas or principles by characters, figures, or events in narrative, dramatic, or pictorial form. The dead walls are Wall Street, office walls, screens, exterior building walls, outside window, prison walls, and psychological walls created by differences and misunderstandings. So you'll see that this recurring theme and this imagery throughout the story as you're reading it. So pay attention when you see this idea of walls appear. So you know what to do. Post your questions and comments in the discussion board forum, and I will talk to you again soon.